according to analysts, reports, and whatever, the HD gaming sector of Square Enix, which obviously includes Final Fantasy VII Rebirth and 16, is disappointing with profits, right? WCCF Tech, going off of its latest financial report, which I did pull up right here, is stating that these two games in particular did not meet expectations, are not selling well. Makes you question what's happening with Square Enix, what's happening with Final Fantasy. I want to go down this here because I remember reading something here. Okay, so here are our digital entertainment segment results. In the HD game subsegment, we released multiple new titles, including major titles such as Final Fantasy 16 and 7 Rebirth, but profits unfortunately did not meet our expectations. Net sales in the MMO and games for smart devices PC browser subsegments were lower than in the previous fiscal year. The HD games subsegment booked net sales of 99.2 billion yen and operating loss of 8.1. Despite the release of Foam Stars and Rebirth in quarter 4, initial sales were not as strong as expected, in addition to which an impairment was made to the content production account, resulting in the operating loss. From what I'm understanding here, it seems like the HD game segments as a whole, they are not only putting the entire fault, if you want to say it as the fault, into Final Fantasy 16 and 7 Rebirth. It's just not only there. They didn't just publish those games, you know what I mean? So I want to bring that out front at first, because I see a lot of conversation on Twitter talking about how the idea of the remake trilogy is bad, and 16 was just bad, and these games should have never come out, and it's absolutely stupid. That's not the reason why this is happening. Square Enix, and this is really the conversation that I want to have. Final Fantasy as a whole, the identity of Final Fantasy right now, I don't know that they know what it is. Final Fantasy, if you look back at history, right? Look, I was playing 10-2 music right here because I like 10-2 a lot, you know? But when you think of the OG, right? The big hit Final Fantasies, you think of Final Fantasy X, right? And when this game came out, right, in 2001, the name Final Fantasy meant something huge in gaming. I mean, this was cutting edge technology. It still looks good to this day, 23 years later. And it doesn't hold that same impact anymore, you know? Every time a Final Fantasy game came out, from 6 to 7 to 8 to 9 to 10, I mean, again, looking at the time when this game came out, you had Final Fantasy VII in 1997, right? A little bit under 2 years later, right, you had Final Fantasy VIII. A year after that, Final Fantasy IX. A year after that, Final Fantasy X. You had 3 major Final Fantasies in the span of 3 years, and 4 from 97 to 2001. All of them sold incredibly well. All of them have fan bases that love them still to this day, right? And it culminated with Final Fantasy X, their best-selling Final Fantasy game ever. Over 21 million copies sold, including all the remasters and all that stuff, obviously. Dude, like, there will never be another period like this unless Square Enix does something drastic. And I don't know what that is. I don't know if they know what that is. Damn it, I have no water. I want to think of what they could do. When Final Fantasy VII released, and Final Fantasy VII was one of the biggest titles ever for the series, you gotta look at where it was developmentally speaking, right? They were still using ATB. Let's look at combat, because combat in 16 was such a big discussion point, right? Combat was like, oh, it's not real Final Fantasy, it's an action, it's DMC Light or whatever. And I want to talk about that a little bit, because Night Sky Prince has been bringing up a really good point for a long time, a point that I've thought myself, even when Remake first came out. When Final Fantasy VII came out, ATB was still the big deal. Final Fantasy 1 through 3 were turn-based. I forget what the name of the combat system was, but I know with 4, ATB was introduced. And it pretty much iterated on ATB, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and 9, right? They all essentially iterated on the idea of ATB and its design, right? Active time battle. And then it added whatever it needed to, right? Materia in 7, the GF Junction in 8, right? I forget what it was called in 9, but it ultimately led to Final Fantasy X's combat system, which was, I mean, it was purely, I forget what it's called as well. I suck at this, but its combat system was purely turn-based. ATB was no longer it, but it was still a fantastic combat system. And what I'm trying to say here is that they essentially kept the same ideas. They innovated on a lot of different things. The world, the story, the settings, all these things were different in all the Final Fantasies and made them unique. And the combat systems, for the most part, followed a certain formula while changing it up here and there. 10 went pretty different from ATB. It didn't go with ATB, right? It went with an actual turn-based, not active time battle. And after that, we have big changes, right? 11 was an MMO, so totally different gameplay. 12 played like an MMO, even if it's single player. 13, right, introduced that system, which again, I don't know the name, but it introduced the stagger system, right? 14, MMO. 15, that system. And 16, right? All of these games tried something different after 10. And the success was, you know, it varied by game. It wasn't the same for each individual title. I don't know if Square has to look at that and try to look back at what worked back in the day, right? But 7 Remake brought back ATB in a unique way, right? We know that ATB came back with 7 Remake, and it looks very different. The ATB system in 7 Remake is fucking genius because it blends action and turn-based. You do regular like actions, you do regular attacks and regular little things like that to build up your meter, and that's how you choose your specific actions. Time slows down, right? You get to really think logically, use like your brain. It's a beautiful system. It's one of the best systems I've ever played in any game. Looking at the creator, right, Teruki Endo, who came from Capcom, who came from Monster Hunter, funnily enough, a game that is also very methodical, a game that asks you to take your time and make sure you commit to your actions. This is the perfect blend. I don't know if this is going to solve the issues for Final Fantasy of just sticking to one type of combat system, iterating upon it, giving it its own identity with every, you know, subsequent game title, and then putting the story and putting everything else on top. I don't know. I couldn't tell you that, if it's going to work. But I think they should try it. When Final Fantasy was at the top of the game, when they were king, right? They were doing this. They were iterating on previous combat systems and just putting stuff on top that made it unique. Let's try it again. You've got nothing to lose, Square Enix. You really don't. And just to give you some feedback, right? The way that I feel about Final Fantasy right now is very complicated because when I first got into Final Fantasy, was around, I want to say like maybe the year 2000. I first played Final Fantasy VIII, right? That was my first Final Fantasy that I played on my own. I watched my brother play 7, but 8 was the first one that I played. And I loved it, right? Fell in love with it. It was a really, really unique system, really unique storytelling. I mean, everything was so cool. Eventually, I would play 7, I would play 9, but then 10. 10 was the one that made me fall in love with the franchise. 10 blew me away. I mean, it's my favorite game of all time right now. And after that, you know, 11 came out, and I didn't pay any mind to it because I didn't want to play an online game. 12 came out, bought it on day one, right? Enjoyed it. Not my favorite, but I really enjoyed it. I think it's a great game. 13, bought it midnight release. Enjoyed it as well. Has its issues, but I was one of the few people at the time that actually did not hate the game. I actually really enjoyed 13, and I still do. I want to do a replay of that game at some point in the future. 14, love it now. Didn't play it on release, but finally got into it last year, and I absolutely adore 14. 15 was one of the weaker entries for me. I didn't enjoy it too much. And then of course 7 Remake, loved it. 7 Rebirth, loved it. 16, loved it. And when I say I loved it, I really do mean I love these games, right? They have their issues, you know, but I've never left. 13-2 also, obviously, the trilogy as well. 13-2 I really enjoyed. Lightning Returns is a very mixed bag. Lightning Returns is a game that has good combat, good music, and that's kind of it. The production values are all over the place for that game. But I still enjoy it. I still think Lightning Returns had something unique to it, and it's really the combat system. But it wasn't my favorite. I think Lightning Returns is definitely bottom tier, right? Right up there with 15. I know that's probably a lot of people love 15. I think 15 is a good game. I just don't think it's one of my favorite Final Fantasy. But what I'm trying to say is with all this, and I haven't played many of the previous. I did play Final Fantasy 3, the remake. I never played 1, 2, 4, or 5, or 6, and I do want to play 6 really bad, and also 4. But the point of this is that I've never let go of Final Fantasy. I've never stopped being a fan. I've been, I don't know, something about the series always like called to me. And when I think of where we're at now with Final Fantasy, it sucks to say, but they have lost the impact of their name. You know, I mean, this is a deep cut for many people. Many people would not understand this, but when I was a kid and I first found out of Final Fantasy, there was also, you know, I'm Puerto Rican. I lived in Puerto Rico. And reggaeton is a very big genre that a lot of people, Puerto Ricans, do enjoy, right? There was I don't think they were a group. I think it was just a compilation CD of a bunch of different artists that came together to make a CD. That shit was called Fatal Fantasy. Fatal Fantasy, as I used to say it back in the day. Motherfucker, you had reggaeton artists naming compilation CDs off of Final Fantasy because that shit sounds raw as great ass name that had like a pedigree. You know, my uncle, who is not a gamer, watched Final Fantasy VII Advent Children, and I remember him reaching out to me and being like, yo, this is the coolest shit I've seen fucking forever. This is so sick. He liked it so much, he ended up buying the Final Fantasy anime, thinking he was gonna get more of that, and he didn't get that at all. and my uncle is not a gamer. He is the farthest from a gamer. He's like a fucking gym rat. Does like what's it called? CrossFit and all that stuff. But he really liked Advent Children. I don't know what's gonna happen. I don't know what Final Fantasy needs to do. But I think of games like God of War and Monster Hunter, right? And I want to focus on Monster Hunter particularly because Monster Hunter was a game that really didn't have much in the West. Nobody cared for Monster Hunter in the West. I mean, 100,000, 300,000, maybe a million copies at most in the West. Until Monster Hunter World. And pay attention to this. You had Monster Hunter, you had Monster Hunter DOS in Japan, Freedom Unite, Portable Third, then Try, then 4U. Yet they didn't want to call the reboot Monster Hunter 5, right? They went with Monster Hunter World. That was their next gen PS4 home console edition that looked incredible. Did so many cool things, and that game is what blew up the name Monster Hunter. People know Monster Hunter today because of Monster Hunter World. Dudes, I think Final Fantasy needs to let go of their naming scheme. God of War 1, 2, 3, Ascension, right? All good games. But God of War 2018, just God of War. And then Ragnarok, some of the best-selling games PlayStation has ever had, right? They rebooted the system. It doesn't play the same. It doesn't have the same combat mechanics. Story is very different. But it worked. I think Final Fantasy is going to need to reboot, man. And I don't think this is a hot take. I think most people will agree. The number scheme is just not working anymore. And I don't think necessarily it's that confusing. I don't think people will see 16 and genuinely be like, fuck, do I have to play 15 games before I play this Final Fantasy? I don't think so. I don't think it's that complicated. What I think the issue is, however, that it makes it seem old, right? The James Bond movies, there's fucking, what, 50 of them? Right? And they'll have different subtitles, you know? Final Fantasy is going to have to move away from that. They're going to need subtitles. Final Fantasy, blank. Call it whatever you want. But I think the naming scheme needs to go. And I think it's best if they iterate on the combat system they created for Remake and Rebirth and whatever. The Remake trilogy, right? That combat system is incredible. Iterate on that. That might solve it. Will that actually solve the issues with Final Fantasy? I don't know. Will Final Fantasy ever sell like it did before? I don't know, but I hope it does because it is one of my favorite franchises. I don't want it to go this way. I don't really think it's dying either. I think there's a lot of staying power to the name, but I'm not gonna lie and say that everything is okay because it's not. Seven Rebirth is a Game of the Year contender. It was the highest rated game this year so far, and the conversation on Twitter, it was when Rebirth came out. So many people were talking about this shit, man. I could not believe how many people were talking about Final Fantasy VII Rebirth. I thought it was a shoo-in for millions of sales, and it did it. So something needs to happen. What it is, I don't know, but I hope they figure it out soon.